For some reason, the issue of school and schooling choice is virtually invisible in the public discourse in most of Europe. In North America, school choice is a lot more popular, but frequently under assault by various control freaks. Do all of these even matter? Does school and schooling choice matter? And why? Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. Being able to choose what to study and when, how, where, and with whom to study, or dare I say, even to study anything at all, should self-evidently be one of the fundamental rights of children and families. But for the most part, it isn't. And it isn't for so many reasons that it would take hours to explain. So I'll try my best to make this as short as possible and focus a bit more on why liberty matters rather than why too many people for now think that it doesn't. For starters, allow me to define the terms. By school choice, we mean any program or trade-off or absence of regulation that enhances the liberty of parents and children to choose their education whilst simultaneously shrinking the influence of the state. Now, there are numerous programs that fall more or less under the umbrella of school choice. Voucher systems, such as the ones in Sweden or the ones in some US states like Florida or Georgia, are essentially school choice programs because they put the money and the control in the hands of the parents rather than the state or the teachers' union. Tax credits for education savings accounts, absence of zoning laws, either de jure or de facto, which assign children by force to schools based on their address or zip codes, all of these are essentially school choice programs. Now, as it's self-evident, the examples provided vary in the degree of actual choice enabled and have their own shortcomings. But they do enhance the choice in comparison to the standard in Europe and most of North America, which is to have the state deciding which school you're allowed to go, what will you study, with whom, and where, and all the rest. By schooling choice, on the other hand, we mean any program or absence of regulation that allows pupils and their parents to choose not just the school, but the form of schooling itself, including to choose not to go to school at all. Homeschooling, unschooling, magnet schools or similar schools which are exclusionary by definition, all of these fall under the schooling choice umbrella. Now, one thing becomes obvious with these two terms. While all school choice options are indeed schooling choice, the reverse is not true at all. For instance, Sweden is praised by many as being a model to aspire to. The Economist says that Sweden's system of school choice is one of the freest in the world, and countless think tanks don't stop lauding Sweden for its greatness on this topic. This year, the Cato Institute insisted on praising the Swedish system as a liberty paradise on this topic with very convincing arguments like the fact that the schools now have more immigrants in them in the places which used to be dominated by the Swedish middle class. Now, I don't know how that's a good thing, but Cato is notorious for not knowing absolutely nothing about Sweden. In reality, from 1992, since Sweden loosened the noose a bit on education and until present day, the enrollment in private schools has increased from 1% to almost 10%. Now, sure, that's spectacular, but when compared to the Netherlands, where 76% of pupils are enrolled in private schools, we suddenly realize that Sweden may not be that fabulous paradise that Cato is selling to us. What most definitely nobody says when it comes to Sweden, or Germany for that matter, we'll get to Germany soon, is the absolutely fascist manner in which this so-called freedom of education is actually enforced. Yeah, sure, you're free to choose one of the many shitty schools we allow to exist, and if you don't like it, we will kidnap your child and you'll never see him again. This is what happened to Christer and Annie Johansson, the parents of Dominic Johansson. In June of 2009, the Swedish social services broke the international law as they descended into a plane preparing to take off to India. And why did they do that? Well, the parents of Dominic opted to homeschool him since they would be leaving the country later that year, and he had only been turned 7 for a few months prior to the move. Their move was legal at the time, and technically it still is, to the extent that free speech is constitutionally protected in North Korea, that is. But these parents' decisions did not go well with the control freaks in the Swedish state, and they decided to quite literally abduct this family's child right in front of them in the plane and place him somewhere with another family. This November 22nd will be the anniversary of 6 years since his parents haven't spoken to or at least seen a photo of their child. All of these for the crime of wanting to homeschool him for a few months. Now, I will leave links in the low bar with the minutiae of the case. And you will notice a pattern in those links. None of them come from the cathedral media. Because, you see, the Johansson's case doesn't fit the narrative at all. To make things more interesting, the Johansson's case is not an isolated special case, but rather the norm. The state abducting children or threatening to abduct them is so common in Sweden that it is not even news. Welcome to Sweden. Now, why would anyone try to avoid the paradise of this freedom to choose education that Cato keeps on lauding? Well, for starters, because it is, in fact, an utter shit. Education stakeholders in former communist countries like Latvia or Romania or Poland like to complain that education is shit in their own countries because the post-communist authorities could not take care of it. Well, maybe not. I'm not particularly convinced by that argument, but Sweden's educational quality is even lower than that. In mathematics, for instance, Sweden narrowly beats Romania and Hungary, but it loses by quite a distance to Russia, Lithuania, Portugal, Latvia, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Vietnam, Poland, or Estonia. Portugal has the highest illiteracy rate in Europe, and the rest of those that I mentioned still had gulags merely a generation ago. Sweden, on the other hand, didn't even see the horrors of World War II on its soil and has been continuously a free nation. Now, whether you subscribe to the hypothesis that immigration is what's dwindling the results or the hypothesis that school choice itself is at fault, the fact remains that the education in Sweden is not so liberal as many would want us to think, and it's also not good at all. Now, why is that? And I know that I'm spending maybe too much time on Sweden, but that's because Sweden is being paraded as a poster child for so many good things, and in most cases, that parade is based on misleading information or, more often, on provable falsehoods. The reality is that religious schools, even when they don't get any funds from the government, are constantly under assault, but only if they're Christian or Judaic. If they're based on the religion of peace, then that's okay. Even when they do end up providing upstanding citizens who fight for the Islamic State and then return to Sweden to get welfare as war veterans. Seriously, I'm not joking. Links in the low bar. Meanwhile, schools and even kindergartens that teach 4-year-old boys that they're not boys are absolutely okay and praised by the CNN and the rest of the leftist media complex. Progress, comrades. Progress. Under these circumstances, the statement that I made a few minutes ago becomes self-evident in my view, namely that while all school choice options are also schooling choice, the reverse is not true at all. In Germany, you have school choice in the sense that there are few limits on what school you can choose. In practice, though, the number of private schools is minuscule, and homeschooling brings you the German equivalent of the SWAT team at your house to swiftly kidnap your children. I wish I were exaggerating. In Finland, another education system lauded by all the usual suspects, you also have school choice, but all schools are absolutely identical, that is to say, mediocre. Excellence is de facto banned in the glorious Finnish Republic, where gifted students are required to help out the idiots in the class instead of cultivating their native excellence to have a shot at making a difference in the world. Yeah, sure, there are virtually no illiterate dumbfucks coming out from the Finnish education system, but there are also no geniuses because the gifted children are constantly constrained to drop their motivation to be as good as they can because, you see, that's not fair to the retarded schmuck in the back of the classroom. Now, what I just said is bound to be deemed insensitive by those who've been incredibly pampered from words and placed in a bubble where everyone is nice and smiling just for the sake of being nice and smiling. Well, I got news for you. Some children are naturally brilliant and gifted, and some children are retarded and dumb. And you cannot make a dumb retarded to be brilliant and gifted. You just can't. Attempting to do so in the name of equality can only result in hindering the progress of gifted children and with them the progress of the society as a whole. Well done, Finland. With these three examples in mind, we can now move towards the second part of this talk, namely on whether any of these matter, and if they do, why is that the case? Now let me try an analogy here. Let's take having an internet connection at home. Surely we can agree that one is better off if one has an internet connection at home in this day and age than if one doesn't have such a connection. But you see, there are people out there who cannot afford an internet connection or who simply do not want an internet connection at all. They like their phones and their libraries and don't want anything to do with the internet. Now, suppose a government program emerges that provides subsidized internet for those who cannot afford it. After a while, the government realizes that it is essentially subsidizing access to messages that are inconvenient to the government. As such, the government builds its own infrastructure which is censored and more civilized. You know, no blasphemy, no hate speech, no politically inconvenient speech, no curses, take your pick. The government always wants to take care of you whether you want it or not. After building its own infrastructure with money taken from the private internet service providers in the form of taxes, the government then provides free internet to everyone. After a few more years, the ISPs find it harder and harder to compete because competing whilst someone is stealing from you and giving the same thing for free to your potential customers is not something easy to do. So eventually, private ISPs file for bankruptcy and a few small ones become non-profits providing internet only for those evil people who want to be free. After another decade, the government finally decides to ban private ISPs altogether and to make it mandatory to use government internet and arrest anyone who tries to avoid being connected or who tries to use private connections to work around the state censorship. In just a few short years, the government internet becomes terribly slow, connections repairing process becomes bloated and bureaucratic, and the rules on that internet rapidly go out of control to become completely insane. Does this sound familiar to you? Well, it should, because this is roughly the history of education throughout Europe and North America. It started nice and private and gradually became the bloated, inefficient, ideologically driven cretinism that it is today. Now sure, there are exceptions, but they exist largely as exceptions to just confirm the rule. Admittedly, my analogy is not perfect, that's why it is an analogy, but the point of it is that squeezing out liberty in favor of a monopoly enforced by violence, which is the state education system in far too many countries, is not just immoral, but a genuinely bad practice that fails miserably at its intended goals. You see, a state system has a few inherent problems that emerge no matter what. Even in countries like Finland or Sweden, where there is a lot more competition within the state system than in, say, Portugal, these problems still do exist and emerge. The inherent problems of a centralized state monopoly are ideological enforcement and the creation of a bubble over the long run. You see, when everyone is being taught the exact same thing during their formative years, it doesn't take too long to essentially wipe out the diversity of opinion on certain topics. And mind you, this doesn't have to be deliberate. It is just the natural consequence when you create a monopolistic bureaucracy that has its position maintained by force. For example, nobody sits in a room to plot to teach virtually 100% of the children that state-funded education is good per se, but it still happens. And it happens because any bureaucracy has an incentive to perpetuate itself. More to the point, when you have just one alternative, it becomes a lot easier to subvert the whole thing. When you have 1,000 alternatives, it's a lot harder, even with resources available and a strong political will. It's still hard to subvert the education of the majority of children towards a specific worldview. But when it's only one, and that one is state-operated, that's piece of cake. Anyway, so there are two fundamental reasons for which liberty matters in this issue. One, children are unequal, and two, minority rights. Now let's start with the minority rights. An undeniable fact of life is that the most oppressed and the most important and valuable minority is the individual. For all the modern culture's obsession with minority rights, you'll never hear the usual suspects talking about the individual. And that's not an accident. If they were talking about the individual, that would lead to quite a few un-PC conclusions and would cause great harm to the well-paid academics in the humanities who are busy returning utter nonsense in exchange for their generous pay, which in Europe is insured by the taxpayers. In a schooling choice environment, the individual gets to control oneself, and paradoxically to the opponents of the schooling choice, that benefits the society as well. Just think about it for a minute. In most of Europe and North America, various elite colleges and high schools were built and funded by individuals, and not always rich individuals. The trend stopped around the 1940s and it did not resume till this very day. The current systems simply hinder the ability of the individual to do what was fairly common a century ago. And mind you, many of these colleges and high schools were not for profit. In fact, they took care of their poor students a lot better than the welfare state of Prussia, for instance. That arrangement of absolute schooling choice allowed individuals to express themselves in ways that benefited those around them. The modern-day arrangement pretty much frowns upon such individuals, and that is indeed a pity. As for the other reason, it is quite clear to anyone with two brain cells to rub together that individuals, and that includes children, are fundamentally unequal. At the same time, state schools are based on the exact opposite premise, that all children are equal and thus worthy of equal minimal education. Of course, that doesn't really work in practice, at least not to the fullest extent, but the mentality itself does harm quite a significant number of individuals about whom nobody from the teachers' unions really gives a toss about. Most countries in Europe, for instance, have laws that mandate somewhere between 7 and 11 years of schooling for every minor. Sadly, most people agree with that idea, but is it really such a fabulous idea? And if it is, why can't people apply it to themselves without forcing it upon others? The prevailing mentality and the received wisdom is that one can't do anything in life without an education, but the meaning of education has been subverted to always mean formal education. Yet that couldn't be further from the truth. For instance, there are numerous trades out there that can be learned without even knowing how to properly read and write, and derive quite a decent living from those trades. Not to mention outliers like Richard Branson, who has a personal wealth of around $5 billion and who has dyslexia and sucked really bad at school, which he abandoned the second it became legal to do so. On the other hand, 2/3 of the inmates in the United States have at least a high school diploma, which is a lot more than the minimum legal mandate in most of Europe. So maybe, just maybe, success or failure in life doesn't have that much to do with the amount of formal education. And if formal education in a standard school is so good, then why do teens who don't go to school consistently outperform those who did? Now, I'm not trying to make the case here that homeschooling is necessarily better, but I am trying to make the case that liberty is a better trade-off than compulsion. Yes, homeschooling is not for everyone, but it doesn't have to be. It just has to be better for the individual concerned. That's it. And although we've been going on for quite a while, let's quickly address a few of the common arguments put forth against school choice and schooling choice. The most common counterargument and the most idiotic of them is the stance that liberty takes money away from government schools who already complained about being underfunded. Now, for starters, that's not true in all cases. In various jurisdictions, schools received fixed amounts of money, and the implementation of liberty has led to less crowded and less violent public schools and to spending more per student than previously. But let's put that aside for a moment. So what if it takes money away from the public system? Why should that matter? The only ones who may lose from that are the unionized teachers, who themselves are a self-perpetuating bureaucracy. If they weren't a self-perpetuating bureaucracy, they wouldn't be so universally opposed to dynamic payments or some sort of payments that is based on performance and not of their mere existence. Again, using the government internet analogy, but in reverse. Back in 2004, when the state monopoly on telecom was abolished in my country, the main complaint from the unionized employees of the former monopoly was that it takes money away from the public telecom sector and that it puts them in the hands of greedy capitalists who will oppress us with higher and higher prices for the same service. In reality, the exact opposite happened. Yes, the former monopolies suffered for a while, but they rebounded and they now successfully compete with other players in the market. The wages of the workers are higher in real terms now than they were back then, and the industry itself climbed from being the 112th in the world to being the 3rd in the world. I explained in great detail about the telecom industry in my country in this video. The same seems to be happening wherever things have gotten serious about liberty in education. The multiple experiments have yielded results that were unheard of when the government schools were the only ones permitted. Now, is that perfect? No, it isn't. But it doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to better suit the needs for as many individuals as possible. Many of the objections to liberty in education are essentially trivial nonsense, or objections over issues that are an inevitable consequence of a free society. For instance, the academe doesn't stop talking about segregation. In the particular case of Hungary, they whine that gypsies want to go to schools where there are more gypsies, and that non-gypsies prefer schools with fewer gypsies. And I'm like, yeah, so what? No, seriously, so what? You see, segregation is not bad in and of itself. Acts of voluntary segregation happen all the time, and as long as there's no coercion, there's nothing wrong with that. If individuals get what they want without coercing others, who am I to say that they should be doing things differently? And who are the ideologues in the academe to have the audacity to claim that they know better than the tens of thousands of Hungarian parents who make decisions for their own children, or the children themselves, who also make decisions for themselves? And this all boils down to the unshakable dogma that way too many people subscribe to when it comes to this topic. Namely that there are problems, and also that there are one-size-fits-it-all and solves-it-all solutions. And yes, I'm paraphrasing Dr. Thomas Sowell on this because he is absolutely correct. There are no solutions, only trade-offs. I mean, yes, maybe homeschool children are less socialized, although that's a highly debatable stance in and of itself, but maybe the kid wants to become a coder, and public schools in many jurisdictions do suck at this. When such argument is put forth, the opponents of freedom usually resort to demanding codes classes in the government schools, since, they say, it's a field of the future anyway and it should be there. The common theme in the arguments put forth by the enemies of freedom is the disdain for the individual kids themselves. Yes, perhaps coding is a field of the future, although we are now in a tech bubble and we may not be evaluating things properly. But, just because coding is a field of the future, it doesn't mean it should be mandatory. If you're in a small village with 100 kids, for instance, and only one of them wants to get into coding, it's a far better trade-off to allow the maximum amount of freedom so that individual can learn for himself or seek alternatives to do so, than to put the coding in the curriculum for the rest of the 99 kids who don't give a toss about that. Again, the alternatives don't have to be perfect. They just have to better suit the needs on the niche desired by the parent and the child. Now, whenever I see these things, I'm always hit with something to the effect of, well, yeah, Lucian, but there are many crazy parents out there. Think of all the religious nutjobs and subsects who teach kids absolute nonsense and horrible things, wah, wah, wah. And I'm always like, yeah, what about them? No, seriously, what about them? Let them be. Yes, a free world includes tolerating the existence of batshit crazy stuff and attempting to correct it via non-violent means, such as boycotts, shaming, and so on, is a legitimate way. What people who bring such argument don't realize is that their worst fears are already being accomplished and are fairly easy to accomplish via the state-run system. Just Google Operation Trojan Horse and read for yourselves how Islamist nutjobs quite literally took over the state-funded school system in Birmingham, I think, in Britain. Now, the operation in Birmingham was eventually exposed after many years of trying, but there are similar operations going on across Europe, and the almighty state cannot actually stop them. In a private school, where there is an owner or a board of shareholders with whom the buck stops, there's a lot easier to prevent, since firing the disturbing elements who are incompatible with the values of the company or the foundation which owns the school is not really a problem, even with the convoluted and largely messed up labor laws that Europe has. And it's not just religious nutjobs. Other kinds of ideologues can wreak havoc as well. Just recently, a daycare worker was fired because she refused to call a little girl a boy, in accordance to the desires of the homosexual parents of the little girl. What I am trying to say here is that religious nutjobs or other undesirable elements will always try to pull shticks like these, whether it's a state monopoly or a schooling choice type of arrangement. But liberty can indeed limit their success and the effects of their success when that occurs. And yes, it does require more vigilance from the parents and from other community stakeholders. Yes, liberty is indeed difficult. It requires taking responsibilities for oneself, as opposed to dodging those responsibilities to a faceless, inefficient bureaucracy. And actually, that's the primary reason there is such a vigorous opposition to liberty in general. People are afraid of responsibilities. And let's face it, it is understandable. But what we on the liberty side need to do is to explain to people that the alternative is for no one to be responsible. When everyone is in charge, nobody is really in charge. Alright, I've been going on for quite some time now, so I should probably stop here. So, what do you guys think? Am I being too harsh? Is it really such a fabulous idea to have compulsory monopolistic education? Is liberty in education really more dangerous than the irresponsible inefficiency inherent in state bureaucracies? Tell me in the comments, and if you like these kinds of videos, please do consider throwing some shekels this way, because conducting the research in so many countries and languages and putting it all together in a way that is easy to deliver tends to take quite a lot of time. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.